So we're moving on now to the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So looking at the external anatomy of the spinal cord, you can see that, as we've discussed before, you have a lot of white matter with gray matter in the middle. The gray matter is kind of shaped like the letter H, or has like a butterfly shape. There's two grooves in the front and the back, so you have an anterior median fissure and a posterior median sulcus. And then you can kind of see how, coming off of the spinal cord, you have these, we're going to call spinal nerves. We'll talk more about those shortly. In the middle of the spinal cord, there's this little opening or a canal called the central canal. And you may remember from the previous lecture that contains cerebrospinal fluid, just like the subarachnoid space and the ventricles in the brain. So looking at this view of the spinal cord, you can see that there's some similarities between the spinal cord areas and the nerves coming off of it and the vertebra that we talked about with the bones. So you can see the cervical region. There's a cervical region, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal. So cervical region has 8 pairs of spinal nerves coming off, C1 through C8. Thoracic area, 12 pairs. Lumbar, 5 pairs. Sacral, 5 pairs. Coccygeal, 1 pair. Now, for the most part, you can see that these numbers kind of match up to what we had for vertebra, but the big exception is the 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves as opposed to 7 cervical vertebrae. Other external features of the spinal cord include 2 enlarged regions. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there's an area in the cervical region that's a little bit bigger, and same thing in the lumbar region. And that's just because in those areas you get a lot of nerves coming off because of the limbs. So the ones coming off the cervical enlargement tend to go more to the upper limbs, lumbar enlargement more to the lower limbs. If we kind of find the end of the spinal cord, and it doesn't look like much here, but it should come to kind of like a tapering end, like almost like a little point or cone shaped. That's called the conus medullaris. And then, as you can see down here, it looks like you get a fanning out of the nerves coming off the end of the spinal cord. That's called the cauda equina, which is supposed to refer to the fact that it looks like a horse's tail. And then there's a tiny little strip that you can barely see right here in green. This is called the filum terminale or terminalis. And it's just a long strip that connects the spinal cord all the way down to the coccyx. All right. Externally, also we have the same meninges that we talked about with the brain. And these are going to be exactly the same. It's just now that we're talking about them around the spinal cord. So there's a dura mater, which looks like this dark, thick layer, the external layer. There's an epidural space outside of here, a subdural space beneath it. Then you have the arachnoid layer. Beneath the arachnoid layer would be the subarachnoid space, which again contains cerebrospinal fluid. And then the innermost layer, which you generally can't see because it's so thin, it's attached directly to the spinal cord. That's going to be the pia mater. There's these other ligaments that are not shown in this picture. I'm actually going to show them to you in a lab model that we have, but there's these ligaments called denticulate ligaments, which basically adhere the pia mater to the arachnoid layer and other layers of the meninges. All right, like we said earlier, the gray matter is shaped like the letter H, and the areas or regions of gray matter within the spinal cord are called horns. So you have anterior horns, lateral horns, posterior horns. And then this little part of gray matter that kind of connects the two sides, that's called the gray commissure. And in the middle of the gray commissure would be the central canal. So horns, posterior, lateral, anterior. All right, so I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit to just talk about this, and then I'll come back to this slide because I know this slide is kind of wordy. So I'm going to put this big picture up and kind of just talk through it. So what I want you to get out of this picture is, here's the spinal cord, here's the gray matter with the horns that we just talked about, white matter out here. These two kind of branches that go into the spinal cord and connect the spinal nerve to the spinal cord, these are called roots. So there's a posterior root, there's an anterior root. The posterior root always contains sensory neurons. That's just how it is. So sensory neurons bringing information into the spinal cord, they're found in the posterior root. Motor neurons, on the other hand, are always found in the anterior root, and they're conducting information or signals out, away from the spinal cord. Then they merge here and form what we call the spinal nerve. There's a little area or enlarged region in the posterior root called the posterior root ganglion, and that is where all the sensory neuron cell bodies are. All right, so sensory neuron cell bodies are in this posterior root ganglion. The motor neuron cell bodies are either in the lateral horn of the gray matter or the anterior horn of the gray matter. And what determines that is if they're autonomic or if they are somatic. So the somatic motor neurons that are going to skeletal muscle are found in the anterior horn, and the autonomic ones that go anywhere else, like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, those cell bodies are in the lateral horn. So that's a key distinction anatomically between the two. So if I go back to this slide, and it should just reinforce what I just said. So the sensory neurons are found in the posterior root, also called the dorsal root. Cell bodies are in this posterior root ganglion. Motor neurons are in the anterior, also called the ventral root, and the cell bodies are either in the lateral horn if they're autonomic or anterior horn if they're somatic. All right, so that takes care of that, and those are all important points. The white matter of the spinal cord is divided into regions called funiculi. So similar to what we saw with the horns, we have posterior funiculi, lateral funiculi, anterior funiculi. Singular would be funiculus, so posterior funiculus if you're talking about one, lateral, and then anterior. And then this little part of white matter that's kind of going across the spinal cord, that's called the white commissure, right in front of the gray commissure. All right, so within the white matter, remember white matter is just myelinated axons. You have axons running up and down the spinal cord in this white matter, and remember we call a bundle of axons in the central nervous system, we call it a tract. So these tracts run up and down the spinal cord. The sensory tracts are also called ascending because they're taking information up towards the brain. The motor ones are called descending because they're bringing signals down away from the brain and sending out. All right, as far as the spinal nerves, revisiting the spinal nerves really quick, there's 31 pairs. Remember, a nerve is just a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, so the axons are bundled into nerves once they leave the spinal cord. And they enter and exit the spinal cord via what we call roots, and those are formed from smaller roots called rootlets. And the anterior root versus posterior root, we talked about differences of motor are found in the anterior, sensory are found in the posterior. And here's a picture showing the rootlets and the meninges as we saw earlier. And here's your posterior root ganglion, posterior root, anterior root, rootlets. There it is. All right, other things about the spinal cord or spinal nerves. You can see in this picture, it looks a little different because the spinal cord is a lot smaller, but you can still see the roots here. They merge, the two roots merge to form the spinal nerve, and they're going to do it in that little space that's called the intervertebral foramen. And that's kind of when the vertebrae start stacking up, you get that little opening. That opening allows the spinal nerves to actually get out of the vertebral column. And spinal nerves are mixed. So once a nerve is formed, we say it's mixed because it has both sensory and motor axons in it, sensory motor neurons. So that's what we mean by mixed. So technically all spinal nerves are mixed because they contain both sensory and motor. So remember, we're not talking about the roots. The roots are either sensory or motor, but once they form the spinal nerve, it's mixed. So this is some interesting information that's going to seem a little overwhelming at first, but once the spinal nerves leave the vertebra, they branch. So they branch into two big branches. One goes to the back of the body. That's called the posterior ramus, and just goes to muscles and skin of the back of the body. Everything else falls under the umbrella of the anterior ramus. All right, and so the anterior ramus basically is going to form nerves that go out to the limbs. It's going to go to the front of the body and the lateral parts of the body. It's also going to have these little things coming off of it. These are called rami communicants. We're going to talk about those later because they have an autonomic nervous system function. But all of this, everything else other than the posterior ramus falls under the umbrella of the anterior ramus. And the other big thing that we're going to talk about shortly, the anterior rami often form plexuses, nerve plexuses. So a plexus is just like a network of nerves. So what you're going to see is some of these spinal nerves kind of intermingle with other spinal nerves and form this network. Those are called plexuses. We have 4 major plexuses in the body, and out of those plexuses are going to come specific nerves with names that go to muscles that we've talked about before. Let's say the biceps brachii. So we'll talk about that shortly. All right. Other things, this is a pretty simple concept, but a dermatome is like an area of skin supplied by a spinal nerve. And so you can see this map that they put together. Basically, it means like if you look at this region, this area of the torso is supplied by spinal nerve pair T10, so thoracic nerve pair 10. And so if you think about this, this has clinical implications because if there's nerve damage, you technically should be able to touch different parts of the skin to see what nerves are functioning properly and which ones are not. So all the spinal nerve pairs innervate the skin with the exception of C1. All right, and what we're going to get into next are the plexuses that we were alluding to. So remember, a nerve plexus is just a network of anterior rami of spinal nerves.